Hi, everyone. Welcome to another segment on Chapter 7, which is costs in the long run, of course. And in this segment, we're going to look at the long run and something called economies of scale. Last time we talked about constant returns to scale, and this time we talk about economies of scale, or what is also known as increasing returns to scale. So, what are economies of scale? Let's have a look. Well, it's simply cost savings that are achieved as a result of large scale operations. So, what it's saying is the bigger you get, the lower your average costs will be as you build bigger and bigger plants. So, the definition here is cost advantages achieved as a result of a large scale. There's that word again, scale. Anytime you hear the word scale, you're talking long run, you're talking building bigger plants. So things that fit into this category are assembly line type of production, like automobile assembly lines. As they get bigger and bigger, they tend to get these economies of scale or cost advantages as they get bigger. So it's the excuse me, the average cost that falls down. Um, Production of standardized products, so the same thing being produced again and again and again, they tend to experience this declining long run average cost, which is what we'll show actually indicates economies of scale. And there's often a few large dominant firms in these types of industries. They're very, very big already. So things like cell phone companies that own cell phone towers, a few large firms in Canada own the cell phone towers. Things like railway car manufacturing, they're mostly manufactured just from one or two producers and then sold. Even refrigerators, even though we have all different brand names, they're often manufactured by just a few big producers of this. And then there's always the classic example in Alberta, but pipelines. When you're building a pipeline, the bigger the circumference, the cheaper per unit it becomes. So the lower average cost as you put in a bigger and bigger pipeline. So let's have a look at what the graph of economies of scale would look like. So there it is, and we're going to read it very similarly to how we read the last one. I'm going to start with my curve here, AC1. So that's my first plant, plant one. And I see that it reaches its 1,000 output at economic capacity, and the average cost there is $40. So you have to kind of humor and be a little bit. I know that doesn't look like it's the minimum of that average cost, but it's the tangent point really. And we're just saying at this output of 1,000, the lowest possible cost of 40 is reached. So then we say, well, tell you what, the manager comes out and says, let's double our inputs, or let's double our cost of inputs, which is saying the same thing. Or let's double the amount of inputs. So we double effectively the size of the plant to AC2, and the engineer does the calculation and says, whoa, wait a sec, sweet move, because now you've more than doubled your output. From 1,000, it went to 2,500, and you only just doubled your input. Or for example, I could say, what if you increased your inputs by 67% and output went up by 80%? You've more than doubled your output. So what happens effectively is you lowered the average total cost of production down to 32. So to draw that, you have to draw this second curve lower. And when you connect them, you end up showing that this is your long run average total cost curve. So remember, it's the one that connects the lines. Let me do that again with a different color and a thick pen if it lets me. And we connect the lines. Sorry, it didn't. But when we draw the line from there to there, that's the beginning of our long run average cost curve, showing economies of scale. And if we had more and more curves, that could continue in its downward slope. But what it means is we've got declining long run average costs when we're seeing economies of scale, when we're seeing cost savings as we increase the size of our plant. So let's dive a little deeper into these economies of scale, or increasing returns to scale. So that means you're seeing decreasing average cost. So keep that in mind as we're seeing increasing returns to scale, that's decreasing average costs. Okay, they can be divided into two broad categories, technical economies and pecuniary economies. That means pertaining to money. And technical economies are also known as increasing returns to scale. So we're going to look at that in a little bit better light here in the next slide. But the output increases by a larger percentage than its inputs. So we saw that on the previous slide where we increased our inputs, say we doubled them, and output went from 1,000 to 2,500. So it more than doubled. So that's the definition of increasing returns to scale. And we're saying that, hey, let's take a look at technical economies on the next slide. We'll look at a couple of examples of what we mean. So where we get these technical economies of scale is from a few different points. So technical economies of scale arise from, first of all, specialization of labor. But as you get bigger, there's a greater scale that you can exploit specialization of labor, right? You can have just a few people that are separated out into different tasks. And if you're a much bigger company, you can have many people separated out into each one of those tasks. So you just got a greater scale, bit greater specialization of labor. There's also management specialization. Why not? I could have one person that manages the marketing, the sales, which is closely related, maybe the production and maybe the finance and maybe the human resources. And that manager is stretched thin. But as you get bigger, I can have someone separate for each one of those, a separate marketing manager, a separate HR manager, a separate finance manager. So you get better specialization as you get larger. And then the last one is the machine specialization. And that's just simply where once you get big enough, you can afford to buy things like robots or better assembly lines that smaller companies couldn't afford. So in all these cases, not only are they benefiting because they're bigger, they're doubly benefiting because they can exploit specialization of labor, management specialization to a greater extent, and even machine specialization. So all of those help with technical economies of scale. So what about pecuniary economies of scale? We mentioned that word pecuniary, and it just means it pertains to money. And there's 4 good reasons. A company can get pretty big, and as it increases in size, generally, there's a lower cost of borrowing. So they pay lower interest rates to borrow large sums. Think of TC Energy. It used to be called Trans-Canada Pipeline. They want to expand pipelines into the US. If they go to the bank to borrow a little bit of money, who do you think is going to get a cheaper interest rate charged? TC Energy or Dave's Picnic Tables? Yeah, and it's TC Energy. They're just bigger and better and more credit worthy. So not only did they have advantage because they're so big, they get a double advantage because they get favored treatment at the banks. There's also buying inputs in bulk. The second point here, and really that just is fairly obvious. Generally, when you buy more and more of a particular product, you get a bigger discount. Certainly, if you're a supplier or an installer of equipment, I used to do that, and I would walk in and they'd immediately look up my account to see how much I had bought in the past, and that'll determine the discount I get off the price today. My cousin, let's call him Dave, used to install furnaces for houses, home heating furnaces with his company, his boss's company, and eventually started sneaking in a few on the side on the weekend. So he'd buy a furnace and install it himself on the weekend and charge the customer. And guess what Dave's boss thought of that? Well, Dave got fired, of course, because he was working on the side and stealing business from the company. So he had to expand out on his own, and he ended up installing 5 or 6 furnaces a week and buying that many. And all of a sudden, the average price that he had to pay for his furnaces declined because he started buying them in bulk. He was pleasantly surprised. The other thing with economies of scale, a lot of times you have byproducts, like let's say wood chips. If you're a great big company and you've got a huge amount of wood chips byproducts from your milling operation, you can actually sell those to other mills. I have a close friend who actually hauls those things with a truck from place to place. So it's because there's so many of them, big customers are interested. If I had my little backyard sawmill where I'm making picnic tables, I've got a few wood chips, No one's at all interested in buying them. They just couldn't be bothered coming there. And if I boxed them up and sent them away, they just wouldn't be interested. So economies of scale happen because of the byproducts of big companies can be sold. And the last one we look at is, what about marketing and advertising? Ask yourself how much you think a 30-second commercial spot during the Super Bowl costs. Look it up. Pause the film. Look it up. It's a phenomenal amount of money. So Dave's picnic tables, I can't afford that. Man, if I could, I'd sell so many, but I can't. I don't have economies of scale there with advertising, but Coca-Cola might. They could pay for that advertising spot. And if they spread the cost out over all the cans of Coke they sell, it's a drop in the bucket, so to speak. So scale in marketing and advertising provides pecuniary or monetary economies of scale as well. Now let's take a look at actually calculating some of these things. Okay, you'll see there's a few different ways to calculate these things. And it sort of depends on how the data comes at you. The whole idea is we want to determine whether if you increase your outputs by a certain factor or a certain percent, or if you increase your inputs by a certain factor or a certain percent, do you also increase the outputs by the same factor or by a greater factor? That'll tell us the difference whether it's constant returns to scale or whether it's increasing returns to scale. So that's all we have to determine. Let's take a look at this first example, and I can see right off the bat, my total cost of inputs went from 30 to 60,000. So it doubled. All I have to do to determine if it's economies of scale is see what happened to output. Doubling of this output from 175 would be to 350. It's actually at 375. So I doubled my input. I more than doubled my output. So I've got increasing returns to scale. Okay, let's say I wasn't quite that quick. Let's take a look at how they do it. Well, they just calculated the average cost. Now remember, this is not one cost curve. This is plant 1, for example, and then this has a cost curve for plant 2. We're finding the lowest average total cost in 2 separate plants. But really, we just calculate it the way you might expect to calculate it. You take the cost divided by the output you got. Cost divided by output, 171.43 per unit. Then you take the cost and divide it by output, 60,000 divided by 375. It dropped to 160 per unit. So that's increasing returns to scale because your long run average cost curve is declining from 171.43 just down to 160. Okay, let's do the same for set 2. And here they say at a cost of 4,500, output was 100, cost of 900,000. So you basically doubled your inputs. Get that, please. If total costs double, because costs are constant, priced wise, if total costs double, that means you've totally increased your inputs by 2. So you double total cost, you double your inputs, same thing. And output, look, it doubled, went from 100 to 200. So I know that that's constant returns to scale. But let's calculate it. So if I click to the next slide, we'll see that the calculations are exactly the same as what they just did. Here we've got our 4,500. We divide that by 100. That's this divided by that. And then we've got our 900,000 divided by 200. That's that divided by that. And in both cases, you get an average total cost of 4,500. So because we've increased the scale of our plant, but the average costs stay the same, that's called constant returns to scale. Keep in mind that we're actually looking at 2 tiny little curves here, 2 short run curves, as well as 2 short run curves up there, but we're connecting the dots and determining in the long run that there's constant returns to scale, or in the previous case, increasing returns to scale. So that's all we wanted to say about increasing returns to scale or economies of scale. In the next segment, we're going to look at diseconomies of scale or decreasing returns to scale, and that'll round out the 3 aspects or 3 different possible points on a long run average cost curve. And incidentally, not all companies will have all three possible scenarios at any given point in time, or even throughout the history of the company. But we'll talk about that in a sec. And then after that next segment, we'll look at some other things about changes in short run and long run costs, and a few other things to talk about in this chapter. See you when we get there.